The whole day was cloudy and even a little gloomy, and towards evening it began to drizzle, accompanied by occasional gusts of wind, and our little courtyard, which already seemed miserable, at such a time made the mood even sadder. The only thing missing from this picture was the pathetic music, so that looking out of the window one could sink into melancholy, as if in anticipation of bad events. Charlotte and I did not live as richly as I would have liked, because not all people are so fortunate that even from the early years the husband has a good job in a prestigious company, where he sits in the office in a jacket, and the wife can sit at home and spend her time only to visit salons and boutiques. But I still had some wealth, which I was proud of and treasured. Charlotte and I had been married for over 15 years, and we had 3 beautiful children, an older daughter, Amelia, and 2 younger sons, Oliver and William. Charlotte was from a simple family, like myself, and we began our life together not because she expected a large income from me, nor because I took her for her beauty, although she was quite beautiful. We got together because we had very warm feelings for each other, and each of us saw only good qualities in the other. The first few years I spent a lot of time at work, even taking double shifts because I wanted us to have the best home possible, and by the 2nd year of our marriage Charlotte was already pregnant. I realized that we needed a little more space than a small apartment, and over the course of 4 years, I managed to raise the amount of money necessary to buy us a house. It wasn't very big, but there was enough space for our whole family, even the children had a separate room. And after many years, during which I was always trying to spoil them with some trinkets for the family, I saw that my children had grown up very good-natured and understanding, without any of the caprices that teenagers suffered at that time, and I was glad of that. And Charlotte, for her part, also tried not to show a disrespectful tone in my direction, although we, as in every family, and sometimes had quarrels. But my wife and I quickly reconciled, because for me the most important thing has always been my family, and my wife loved our children very much, and it seems that her feelings for me have not cooled. And that rainy evening I sat at the window with a book in my hands and tried to distract myself from bad thoughts, because that day Charlotte and I again quarreled. The kids had scattered to their friends and hadn't heard a thing. Charlotte decided to lecture me about how Amelia was about to go to college and she wanted to send her to a more prestigious school, but she needed more money. I convinced my wife that our daughter was smart enough to get into wherever she wanted to go. But Charlotte continued to stand her ground. In the last few months, she would sometimes just fixate on the fact that we needed more money. I was the first to stop our quarrel, promising that I would think about what I could do about it, and to forget about the unpleasant moments. I ducked into a book. And usually I was able to do that, but this torrential rain seemed to echo my wife's critical words, so I dropped what I was doing and went to the kitchen to get the last can of beer out of the refrigerator. Oh, I found it. This is where the money goes. Instead of putting it towards his daughter's education, he's buying beer for himself. Charlotte appeared in the kitchen behind me, out of nowhere. Okay, that's enough. I can't do this anymore. What's gotten into you? You've never been like this before. What happened now? Yeah, I remember my daughter. I don't forget about our kids for a minute. And I told you I'd handle it. Why are you trying to blow my mind right now? Did your girlfriends whisper something to you again? What does that have to do with girlfriends? I've already explained everything to you. And I heard you. That's it. That's enough. I nervously closed the refrigerator door and headed for the exit. I didn't want to start another fight, so I went to our barn, which I had already converted into a small workshop where I could spend my free time making wooden figures. I worked at a sawmill, and I had no trouble bringing home random scraps of wood, which I turned into boxes or little statuettes or something fancy. Charlotte kept saying something to me, but I didn't listen to her after all. I knew that after a while she would calm down and her normal mood would return. Entering the barn, I threw my shirt, which had managed to get wet in the time I had traveled that short distance, on the rack, and for a while I just sat at the table looking at my unfinished work. After a few minutes, when the can of beer was empty, I took up the piece of wood again and continued planing it. But for some reason this time I didn't succeed, and I ruined several pieces. And then I just leaned back in my chair and sat with my eyes closed for a while, because the weather was still dreary. I woke up to my wife pushing me in the shoulder, holding an umbrella in one hand. Her face no longer expressed a stormy mood, and she seemed to have finally calmed down. She said it was getting pretty late and called me into the house, telling me that she and the kids had already eaten dinner, but she had left a warmed-up portion for me. What I really appreciated about her was her concern for her family and her generally good attitude toward others. She even took all the old stuff that people would normally throw in the trash to the homeless, whose den was only a block away from our house. Even if she scolded me in the evening, she was still concerned that I wouldn't go hungry. The next day, when the rain stopped, the trees were transformed from the dust that had accumulated on their leaves, and everyone was in a better mood. I started getting ready for work and the kids for school. Charlotte stayed home for a few days because the store where she worked was being renovated and all the employees were temporarily laid off. I kissed her before I left, as usual, and asked her about her plans for the day, to which she replied that she was going to visit an old friend of her mother's who lived in a neighboring town. She had been going there once a month for the past few years and visiting the old lady. "I'm the one who won't see you for 24 hours. I said. "Oh, come on. I told you my mom was very friendly with her, and before she died, she asked me to visit Aunt Camilla once in a while. Don't worry. Time will pass quickly, as usual. I've prepared food for all of you, so you won't go hungry. Aunt Camilla will be happy to see a familiar face again. Didn't I tell you how she loved and spoiled me when I was little? Well, go on, or you'll be late." Charlotte reported back and handed me a suitcase with my favorite peanut butter sandwiches. I went to work, and in the evening Asher, one of my co-workers with whom we had become good friends, invited me to sit with him at a local pub and have a beer. But I declined, because that was the night when taking care of the kids was completely on me, and I didn't want to look irresponsible in front of them and my wife. Ethan replied that he was sorry, because he had won quite a large sum in the lottery and would have liked to celebrate with me. But I convinced him to do it the next day, to which he agreed, albeit reluctantly. When I got home, I saw only my sons. When I asked them where Amelia was, they said she had left with her boyfriend on a motorcycle. After feeding my sons, I stayed in the house and did not even look in the workshop. I wanted to wait for my daughter to come back so I could talk to her, since she hadn't told me she was going out today. Besides, I didn't really like the guy she had started dating. He was 2 years older than her and a little known for his dashing behavior in our small town. And the fact that his vehicle was a motorcycle bothered me, too, because I didn't think motorcycles were a safe means of transportation, especially knowing that Pike could afford to drink before he got behind the wheel. Time passed and still no daughter. I called her several times, but she didn't pick up. It was almost midnight when I heard the sound of a motorcycle parked outside the yard. Soon the door opened and Amelia walked in. I could tell by her gait that she too had a drink, which Pike had obviously offered her. When she saw me in the dim light of the nightlight, she immediately excused herself, saying that she was perfectly normal and hadn't been drinking at all. "Daughter, sit down," I called her. "I don't want to punish you in any way or put you under house arrest. But you have to understand that I'm very worried about you and this Spike." "Pike." My daughter interrupted me. "Oh, yeah. Pike. He's a bad influence on you. Look at him. He's already gotten you drunk. What's gonna happen next? I didn't raise you right. You were always a good daughter before. That Spike, he doesn't even have a real job. Pike. Dad, his name is Pike. You can't even remember his name right, and you're trying to prove something to me. And he has a job." My daughter interrupted me again. How is being a bouncer at a club a job? I mean, think about it. What can he do with his life? He didn't even go to school. Oh, baby. I just want you to be okay. Besides, you know his dad's been in prison for years. What's that guy gonna give you? My daughter listened to my lectures for a while longer. I didn't want to punish her in any way. I always thought that a frank conversation was more effective than a trivial punishment. Soon Amelia listened to my words and promised to be more careful. But she was already attached to this guy and thought she loved him. She also promised that she would talk to him so that he would find a more normal job and change his motorcycle for a car. The next day, at the end of the workday, I called my wife and made sure she was already back. Then I approached Ethan and told him I was willing to take him up on his offer to sit with him over a beer. For some reason, he chose the bar where Pike was temporarily working. I didn't see him there, though I looked around periodically. A little later, when Ethan and I went out for a smoke, I noticed him standing nearby with other guys who looked like him. When Ethan finished smoking, I asked him to come back. I wanted to talk to this Pike guy. I just wanted to warn him not to hurt my daughter in any way and never offer her alcohol again. Pike. Hey, Pike. I called out to him from a distance. We need to talk. He whispered something to his buddies, then moved leisurely toward me. Yes, Mr. Logan. What did you want? He asked a little arrogantly as he approached me. Amelia. I don't know how you managed to capture her heart or what she saw in you. But I just want her to be safe. And your way of life. My way of life. He interrupted me. I have a pretty good life, and I make a good living. I'm sure your daughter didn't feel as happy with some nerd as she did with me. His tone started to irritate me, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to have a normal conversation with this jerk. A sudden rage erupted in me, and I grabbed him by the collar. Listen to me, you sucker. I don't think you understand me. I told you I don't want my daughter in danger. And if you can't get your life together, you don't go anywhere near her. Do you understand me? Honestly, I thought that bastard was going to show his superiority and use his hands too. But he didn't, just smirked back. I let him go and got ready to leave, hoping that Pike would take my advice and leave my daughter alone. As soon as I took a couple steps, however, I heard his voice behind me again. You talked me out of it, but you'd better watch your wife. I'm sure you don't know where she actually goes every month. I turned sharply and took a step toward him. What did you say? Say it again. What you heard. Charlotte doesn't go to a nursing home at all. She visits my father in prison regularly. They have visits there. He admitted it to me the other day. But don't worry, I haven't said anything to Amelia. I like her a lot. But your wife does. You bastard. I jumped up to him again, grabbed him by his jacket and threw him to the floor, and even punched Asher once in the face. How dare you talk about my wife like that? I growled, taking another swing at him. And then I noticed that his buddies were heading in our direction, obviously to deal with me. But Pike waved at them, letting them know he was okay, and they stopped. I wanted to slap the bastard a couple more times for his dirty words, but I didn't and let him go, if only because I could have been beaten up by a bunch of drunken assholes myself. Stay away from Amelia. I warned you. That's all I said to him, and then I went back inside and told Ethan I had to leave. All the way home I couldn't get away from the words Pike had said to me about my wife. I remembered that a few years ago, shortly before his father had gone to prison, Charlotte had worked at the cafe then and was friends with the same group that Pike's father, Leo, was a member of. But she didn't give me any reason to be jealous, especially since she was already pregnant with our third son. And then there was a bank robbery, and the bandits were soon caught, Leo included. The police proved his involvement, but the money was never found, and even years later neither he nor his accomplices had ever admitted where they had stolen the loot. And something told me that if what Pike said was true, Charlotte might know something about it. But why didn't she tell me and visit the criminal in secret? I'd trusted her so much all these years. When I entered the house, all I wanted to do was talk to my wife and find out the truth and where she was really going. I went straight to her with the intention of talking to her, even though the kids were home and still awake. She was sitting with them in the living room watching some movie. I called out to her from the hallway, and when she came out to me, I grabbed her arm and dragged her into the kitchen, closing the door behind me. "What the hell happened? Are you drunk?" Charlotte said indignantly, pulling my arm out. "Tell me what happened. Tell me where you really went yesterday and all those years ago. Are you out of your mind?" "I told you Aunt Camilla." "Who the hell is Camilla?" I could feel myself getting angry. "Answer me. Is it true you've been going to Leo's all this time?" I asked and grabbed her hand again. As soon as I said the name, I saw Charlotte stiffen with surprise, and fear flashed in her eyes. But she must have been determined to stand her ground. I realized that she wasn't just hiding her visits to Leo, and no matter how much I questioned her, Charlotte continued to stand her ground and even insulted me in return, and then left me alone, saying she needed to send the kids to bed. I realized that there was no way Charlotte was going to admit to this. But on the other hand, if she was so sure she'd never seen Leo in all those years, then maybe Pike had decided to mess with me and just made it up. Anyway, I decided to find out for myself. The next day I excused myself from work and traveled to another town where, according to my wife, Aunt Camilla was spending her days in a nursing home. The nursing home in this town was only in Asher, and I had no trouble finding it quickly. Old Camilla did live there, but she was not as helpless as Charlotte had described to me, a self-sufficient old woman. She didn't know me, or at least didn't remember me, because we'd only seen each other a couple of times when Charlotte's mother was alive. Now I was a complete stranger to Camilla. But I didn't hide who I was from her, and after talking to her for a while, I moved on to asking about my wife. In my heart I still hoped that my wife was telling me the truth and I was worrying for nothing. But Camilla's answers didn't live up to my expectations, and I realized that Charlotte had only come here a couple of times, if at all, and a long time ago. So Pike wasn't lying to me. But the woman I trusted the most was. And she's been so skillful at pretending all these years. But why would she do this to me? I left Camilla full of disappointment, resentment, and anger. And I was glad I was so far away from my wife at that moment, because in a fit of rage I could have done anything. In my anger, I didn't know what to do. Should I go straight home and clear things up with my wife for good? After all, she couldn't deny that she hadn't been to Leo's. Or I could go to Leo and ask him directly. But what would he say? Although, if he had the same temper as his son, he might say something to me in a fit of temper. But at the same time, I felt a sharp pain in my heart from the wound Charlotte had left me. After all, according to Pike, she had a relationship with his father. To numb the pain, I went to the nearest pub. I had a double drink and then just leaned my head against the bar, pondering why my family was in such trouble. After all, I'd never hurt Charlotte and I couldn't think of anything that would make her take such a step. While I was pondering this, a woman approached me. She was of a fairly mature age, but dressed too revealingly and with very bright makeup. I knew immediately that this was a local whore trying to earn herself another round of drugs or booze. Actually, judging by the dark bags under her eyes, which she was trying so hard to hide with foundation, she was. She didn't even have time to speak to me, she just turned around, and I immediately said a bunch of mean things to her face that were really meant for my wife. I called her a whore and a corrupt woman who doesn't know what fidelity and true love are. She was clearly offended, but she didn't say anything in response, just grimaced and walked away from me. I didn't care what she thought. My mood was even worse. I swallowed 2 more drinks, and then I realized that alcohol wouldn't solve my problems anyway. Leaving the bar, I decided to visit the bastard my wife was so attached to. But I didn't know what prison he was in. So I went back to our town and went to the police station. We had a pretty normal relationship with the sheriff, and I was hoping he would help me with my request. So as soon as I was in his office, I immediately asked if he could tell me exactly where Leo was. "What do you need him for?" the sheriff asked. "I need to find out something. You may have heard that his son is now dating my daughter. I'd like to look into the roots, so to speak." I had to make it up as I went along and lie a little to the sheriff. I couldn't openly tell him that my wife might be cheating on me with the bastard. Yes, I still wanted to believe that what I'd learned wasn't true. But I also really wanted to know what was really going on. So after I got the information I needed from the sheriff, I traveled to another town not far from ours to meet the man my wife might have traded me for. In this gloomy place surrounded by barbed wire, I had to go through a series of more checks before I was allowed to enter the visiting room. A few minutes later, I saw a huge, fat man in an orange jumpsuit, with a shaved head and stubble on his face. He clearly wasn't expecting visitors, much less me. It looked like he had already been told who his visitor was, and now he was walking around not just disgruntled, but with clear signs of aggression. When he sat down at the table across from me, the guard stayed in the room to keep an eye on him. Leo leaned back in his chair and stretched his legs out under the table, glaring at me sullenly. "What did you want me to do, Logan?" he asked. "Leo, I know you get regular visits from my wife. Tell me, why? What's your connection to her? And don't tell me it's an old friendship." "Oh, so little Logan still doesn't know anything." He grins widely. "This is gonna be even more interesting than I thought. Look, I didn't come here to play games. Talk, you son of a bitch. Why was my wife here? And that bitch still manages to make it in life. I thought you two broke up a long time ago. But what can she do on her own? She'd have to wait a long time for me. And you're holding her close to you. I don't understand." "What do you mean?" "You're so stupid. She's waiting for me to come out because she's hoping she'll get some of the stolen money. She even kept pleasuring me on every date to prove that she's my bitch. But why do I need that senile fool now when I can find myself someone I want?" Every word he said cut into my soul like a red-hot dagger blade. I couldn't take it anymore, and I lunged at him, despite the guard at the door. I managed to punch him in the face a couple times, but despite the fact that Leo was handcuffed, he was quite strong. Apparently that was a quality he'd acquired while doing time. He managed to push me away, and I got hit in the cheekbone, too. Only then did the guard get up from his seat and, pulling out a rubber truncheon, gave him a good slap on the back. "Sit down," shouted the guard. Leo returned to his original position. I stared into the eyes he kept drilling into me, but I didn't want to talk to him anymore. I'd learned enough already, and now I was certain that Charlotte had indeed been cheating on me all these years. All that remained was to find out why. Was it really about money? That's what I decided to ask her. "I'm done," I told the guard and walked to the door. I was let out, but I could still hear the guard outside the door reminding Leo of the rules of behavior with his rubber wand. I drove home in an even more furious mood than before. I couldn't wait to deal with my wife and give her a real interrogation. But I remembered that there were children at home, and I didn't want them to get hurt. When I looked at my watch, I realized it was the end of the day at the sawmill, and I decided it would be most appropriate to invite Charlotte there. By then it would be empty and we could yell at each other. I called my wife and told her I was expecting her at my work and that I had a surprise for her. After our last conversation, she reluctantly agreed. I had to say a few kind words to convince her, and Charlotte said she would be there in about an hour. At the appointed time, I was already waiting for her at the entrance. There was only Asher, the watchman, and I convinced him that I wanted to give my wife a tour. Then I led her through the store and into a small office. "Where's your surprise?" Charlotte asked curiously. "Have a seat. You and I are going to have a very interesting evening. I have something to tell you, and I want you to be honest with me." "Come on, Logan. When have I ever not been honest with you?" Charlotte asked, but I could tell by the look on her face and the slight tremor in her voice that she already knew what she was talking about. I closed the door and walked over to the wall where the massive saws hung. I took one of them and sat down at the table, then took the file and began to slowly run it over the teeth. As I did so, I looked at my wife after each stroke. "Honestly, you say? Then tell me, how is Aunt Camilla doing? Or don't you even know what she looks like?" "What? Logan, what are you talking about?" "Aunt Camilla. That's enough." I threw the sandpaper board on the table with force. "I was at Leo's. And we had a rather interesting conversation." As I continued my speech, I watched my wife and saw her growing paler by the second, glancing at me and at the saw, which I continued to hold in my hand, gripping it so tightly that I didn't notice that the tines were digging into my skin, and a few drops of blood were already dripping onto the tabletop. "Logan. Your hand. Stop." I screamed again. "Stop messing with my head. Tell me the truth. I want to know the whole truth from the beginning. How are you related to him and why does he think you belong to him? Otherwise, I'm gonna fix your face with this saw without anesthesia." "Logan. I'm sorry," she exclaimed, realizing I meant it. "It was years ago. I was so stupid. I fell for his promises. He said that if I waited for him, he'd share the money he'd hidden with me. And I just had to. He blackmailed me into telling me everything." She was crying. "Tell you what? What don't I already know? William. William. What happened to William? I thought he had some serious illness or that Leo was going to do something to him when he got out. But what does that have to do with the baby? William is his son." She stammered and then stopped crying. When I heard that, I was filled with anger, and the pain of the horrible truth was tearing me up inside. I stood up and walked over to Charlotte. Grabbing her by the hair, I started screaming what a disgusting slut she was and how much I hated her. I expected anything but that. And then I swung at her with the hand I still held the saw in and managed to see the fear in her eyes before I brought my hand down hard on her head. But only I couldn't mutilate her and make her as mangled as my heart. The saw teeth dug into the tabletop just a few centimeters from her face. And then I noticed that Charlotte even wet herself with fear. "I don't want to see you in the house or around my children anymore." I told her this in a quieter voice and left the office. I didn't want to know her again, ever. And I didn't care where she went or what happened to her. I just wanted to turn the page and try to move on with my life, giving myself only to my children. And when I got home, there was another unpleasant event waiting for me. Amelia was sitting in the kitchen, crying. When I asked her what had happened, she told me that she'd gotten into a fight with Pike when she caught him with her friend. At that moment, I didn't know what to say to her, so I just hugged her. In the back of my mind, of course, I was glad that my daughter wouldn't have to deal with that little scumbag anymore, but I didn't tell her about it. After a while, Charlotte and I parted ways for good. Of course, I let her spend a few more nights in the house so she could pack her things and find a place to live, and then the lawyer handled the divorce. I only felt sorry for the kids, since it wasn't their fault in any way. But I believed that in time they would understand why it had happened. Some time later I learned that Leo's sentence had come to an end. But when he was released and Charlotte found him, he wanted nothing to do with her and rejected her completely, not even recognizing that William was his son. Charlotte came to me then and tried several times in tears to beg my forgiveness and allow me to come home. But I didn't need such a traitor anymore. The children and I had gotten a little used to living without her, and Amelia had successfully enrolled in college with no extra money. I was glad for what I had left, and now paid just a little more attention to the youngest, hoping that he would forever accept my guidance and the genes of a biological father wouldn't awaken in him.